All right, so get ready, because today we're going deep, really deep, into human behavior.
Deep, yeah.
Yeah, into the science of evil.
Mm.
We're going to unpack some fascinating audio chapters from a leading neuroscientist.
Okay.
And it all comes down to this idea, this concept of 0 degrees of empathy.
Yeah, it's a tough one, a really challenging concept for sure.
Yeah.
We tend to think of evil as this, kind of abstract, this force out there.
Right.
But what if it's something much more, real, concrete, like rooted in the biology of our brains?
So can we actually understand evil through the lens of science?
Right.
And if so, what does that tell us about, what makes someone capable of really horrific acts?
Yeah, so that's where this idea of an empathy spectrum comes in.
The empathy spectrum.
Yeah, you see, our capacity for empathy, that ability to understand and share the feelings of others, it's not all or nothing.
Okay.
It exists on a spectrum, really.
A spectrum.
Yeah, and it's influenced by a bunch of things, our genes,
Okay.
our hormones, how our brains are wired, even
Right.
our life experiences.
So both nature and nurture are playing a part.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And at the very bottom of this spectrum,
The bottom?
yeah, we find what the author calls 0 degrees of empathy.
0 degrees.
It's a
Chilling.
chilling concept, but it might be the key to understanding some of the darkest parts of human behavior.
So let's unpack this.
Okay.
The book actually breaks 0 degrees of empathy into different types, right? I have to say that that surprised me.
Really?
Yeah, I thought it was more like a black and white kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more nuanced than you might think.
Okay.
Yeah, the author divides them into 0 negative and 0 positive,
Okay.
which I know it sounds a little
Paradoxical. Yeah.
0 positive empathy. That's counterintuitive.
It is, yeah.
But let's start with 0 negative.
I have a feeling those are a bit easier to understand.
You're probably right. Yeah, so under the 0 negative umbrella,
Okay.
you've got 3 main subtypes.
Okay.
Type P, the psychopath, type N, the narcissist, and type B, the borderline.
And these are the folks we often see, committing those horrific acts that make the news, right?
Yeah.
The ones that leave us wonder, shaking our heads like, how could anyone do that?
Yeah, that's often the case.
Right.
And the book, it uses some real-life examples, chilling real-life examples, to illustrate each type.
Like yeah.
Eric Harris,
Columbine.
one of the Columbine shooters, yeah.
Right.
He was diagnosed as a psychopath.
Okay.
And his case, it highlights a chilling truth about this condition.
Okay.
Psychopaths, they can plan and execute these acts of horrific violence without a shred of remorse.
It's almost impossible for me to imagine, inflicting that much pain and feeling absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it's hard to fathom. Their detachment from human suffering, it's a real hallmark of this subtype.
Right.
Yeah.
What about narcissists? How do they fit in?
Well, narcissists, they're driven by this need.
A need.
Yeah, this insatiable need for admiration.
Okay.
And they just lack empathy for anyone outside of their own,
Bubba.
yeah, their own little world.
Yeah.
Think of Joseph Fritzl.
Oh, yeah.
The Austrian man who he imprisoned and repeatedly abused his own daughter for years.
It's just, yeah.
His case, while extreme, it might point to these narcissistic traits.
Right.
He seemed genuinely surprised when he was confronted with, how monstrous his actions were.
Yeah.
Like he was blind to the suffering he inflicted.
It's like their empathy is completely overshadowed by their own, self-importance.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have the borderline type,
Right.
which the book illustrates with the case of Melissa Todorovich.
Melissa Todorovich.
Yeah. She manipulated her boyfriend into murdering a girl she was jealous of.
Why?
All at the age of 15.
You plan us all.
Yeah. This case is, it's particularly unsettling because it shows that a lack of empathy can show up really early.
Yeah, that's a lot for sure.
It is.
So all 3 0 negative types, it sounds like they're all united by this core inability to share the feelings of others.
Exactly.
Even when their actions cause, immense suffering.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's tackle 0 positive.
All right.
Which I realize might sound like
A contradiction?
yeah, contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
This type of 0 degrees of empathy is it's often associated with autism spectrum conditions.
Right.
So I'm really curious to know how a lack of empathy can be considered positive.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem to compute.
It's not about the lack of empathy being positive, really. It's more about how the brain works, how it functions differently.
Okay.
So individuals with zero positive, they often struggle to read social cues and emotions. Right.
But they excel in this thing called systemizing.
Systemizing.
Yeah, they're great at recognizing patterns, applying logic, understanding systems.
So it's not that they're intentionally cruel.
Right.
They just experience the world differently.
Yeah.
They process it differently.
Yeah, their brains are wired for logic and patterns rather than, social emotional processing.
Okay.
Take Gary McKinnon.
Gary McKinnon.
The hacker with Asperger's syndrome.
Right.
He broke into Pentagon computers.
Right.
But he wasn't motivated by malice or anything like that. He was driven by a fascination with systems.
Fascination with systems.
Yeah, thirst for knowledge.
Yeah.
In his case, it highlights how individuals with zero positive can commit crimes without even intending to harm or even fully comprehending the emotional impact.
That's an important distinction.
It is, yeah.
So we've got these different types of 0 degrees of empathy.
Right.
Both negative and positive.
And it's all rooted in how our brains are wired.
Exactly.
But how does it actually work? Like, is there an actual empathy circuit in the brain?
Yes, there is.
There is.
Yeah, it's not just a theoretical concept.
Okay.
It's this empathy circuit is a network of brain regions
Okay.
that work together to help us process emotions, understand other people's perspectives, and feel empathy.
Yep.
And research has shown that individuals with both 0 negative and 0 positive often have differences.
Yeah, atypicalities in this circuit.
So it's not just a philosophical concept. It's actually hardwired into our neurology.
Yeah.
But if it's rooted in our biology, does that mean it's set in stone? Can people with low empathy ever change?
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? And it's one that researchers are actively exploring.
Yeah.
The book dives into, the implications for treatment.
Okay.
Examining, therapies designed to target this empathy circuit.
Educational software that aims to, enhance emotional recognition.
Right.
And even potential interventions like oxytocin nasal spray.
Hold on, oxytocin nasal spray.
Yeah.
That's the love hormone, right?
Right.
We're talking about like a way to boost empathy with medication.
It's still pretty early, early stages of the research, but some initial findings do suggest that oxytocin can enhance empathy in certain contexts. It seems to, work by acting on specific brain regions.
Okay.
Areas that are associated with, social bonding and trust.
Okay.
And potentially modulating the activity of the empathy circuit itself.
So there's a possibility that we might, be able to directly influence empathy through medication.
It's a fascinating avenue.
Yeah.
But, there's still a lot we don't know.
Right.
We need to understand, the long-term effects of these interventions and also carefully consider the ethical implications,
Sure, for sure.
Yeah.
But even if we could pharmacologically enhance empathy.
Right.
It doesn't address the fact that anyone, even someone with, like normal empathy can become capable of cruelty under the right circumstances.
That's right.
I'm thinking of experiments like the Stanford prison experiment or the Milgram experiment.
Yeah.
Those were pretty unsettling examples of, how situational forces can really, really override our better angels,
Right. You're touching on this crucial concept, the banality of evil.
The banality of evil.
Yeah, which was famously explored by Hannah Arendt,
right.
this political theorist.
Okay.
It suggests that even ordinary people, people we wouldn't typically consider evil,
right.
can commit horrific acts when they're, placed in certain situations,
right.
often due to social pressures or blind obedience to authority.
Mm-hmm. So it's not always about a lack of empathy.
Right.
It's more about the power of the situation to really overwhelm our moral compass.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought.
It is, yeah.
It really makes you wonder, like, are we all just a few bad decisions away from crossing that line?
Yeah, that's a question that each of us has to grapple with.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that Banality of evil differs from 0 degrees of empathy in a crucial way.
In a crucial way.
Yeah, with the banality of evil, it's the external situation that's driving the behavior.
Right.
But in cases of 0 degrees of empathy, the root cause is really within the individual, their brain and experiences.
So it's not a simple case of nature versus nurture. It's really this complex interplay of both.
Exactly.
Right.
And that complexity becomes even more apparent when you consider something like terrorism. Clearly not all terrorists fit the profile of a psychopath.
Right.
Or someone with 0 degrees of empathy.
Terrorism is such a,
it's a charged topic.
Yeah, it's a really charged topic. It's hard to even talk about it.
Without getting emotional.
Yeah, without getting emotional, but you're right. It doesn't seem plausible that every terrorist is driven by this complete lack of empathy.
That's right. Yeah, the book tackles this issue, head on. It acknowledges that terrorists often act out of, a deeply held belief system,
right,
or a profound sense of injustice.
So their actions, as horrific as they are, could be stemming from, a twisted sense of empathy, like they're fighting for a cause, even if it means, inflicting pain.
It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer. What's clear is that in the moment of violence, empathy seems to be, shut off,
right,
regardless of the motivations or the perceived justification.
But that makes it all the more tragic, right?
Yeah.
Like if they could only see the humanity of their victims, perhaps they wouldn't be capable of such acts.
It's a heartbreaking thought.
It is, yeah.
And it raises this important question.
Okay.
Can we judge the same act of murder differently based on its motivations?
I'm not sure I have an answer to that.
Yeah.
It feels like, a moral and philosophical minefield.
It is. The book explores this by looking at figures like Nelson Mandela and Menachem Begin.
Okay.
Both men engaged in violent acts during their struggles for political freedom.
Right.
But they were later awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
Right. So one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
Exactly. History is full of these complexities.
Right.
But at that moment of violence, that empathy switch seems to flip off.
Right.
Regardless of how noble the cause may seem.
Yeah, it's a chilling reality.
It is.
It really is. But thankfully, this deep dive isn't all, doom and gloom.
Right.
The book also explores the power of empathy as a force for good.
Yeah.
In fact, it tells this truly moving story about Ahmed and Moish, a Palestinian and an Israeli who both lost their sons in the conflict.
Yeah, their story is it's a real testament to the power of empathy.
Yeah.
Imagine finding solace and understanding in the shared pain of someone you've been taught to see as your enemy.
It gives me chills just thinking about it.
Yeah.
But how did they even meet?
Well, they were brought together by this organization called the Parent Circle.
The Parent Circle.
Which facilitates dialogue and understanding between bereaved families from both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Wow.
It's a powerful example of how empathy can bridge divides that seem impossible to overcome.
It's like a ray of light piercing through the darkness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it demonstrates that even in the most entrenched conflicts, empathy can serve as a catalyst for healing and reconciliation.
It's a powerful reminder that beneath all the labels and divisions, we're all human.
Absolutely. And that shared humanity is really the foundation of empathy.
So we've covered a lot of ground today.
They have.
We've explored the concept of 0 degrees of empathy.
Right.
Examined the different ways that it can manifest. Delved into the workings of the empathy circuit.
Yeah.
And even considered how situational forces and complex motivations can influence our capacity for compassion.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating exploration.
It really has.
Yeah.
But there's still so much to unpack.
Yeah.
For example, if different forms of 0 degrees of empathy all involve the same empathy circuit in the brain,
right,
why do individuals end up with one form rather than another?
That's a great question. Yeah.
What determines whether someone develops, psychopathy or narcissism or autism? Is it all just random chance?
Yeah. Well, it's not random.
Okay.
Remember, we talked about that complex interplay, genetics, hormones, neural pathways, and environmental experiences.
Right.
The answer likely lies in that unique combination of these factors for each individual.
So it's like a recipe where slight variations in the ingredients can lead to vastly different outcomes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And scientists are working to unravel these intricate interactions to better understand, where empathy disorders come from.
It's like piecing together this giant puzzle.
Yeah.
And we're still searching for many of the pieces.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And like any complex puzzle, there are bound to be, missing pieces that we haven't even, considered yet.
Right.
For instance, are there other forms of 0 degrees of empathy that we just haven't discovered yet?
That's a little unsettling, to be honest.
It is. Yeah. It's a possibility we need to be open to.
Right.
Yeah, we're still learning so much about the brain and its complexities.
Absolutely.
And as our understanding evolves, we may uncover, new subtypes or variations that challenge our current models of empathy.
Right.
It's an ongoing process of discovery.
Speaking of challenging our understanding, does someone who commits murder automatically lack empathy? I mean, it seems like, taking another person's life, especially in a calculated way, would be a pretty clear sign of 0 degrees of empathy.
It's a logical assumption, but it might not be that straightforward.
Okay.
The book discusses a case that really
complicates it.
Yeah, complicates this notion. It involves a woman named Rhea Kumar Baker,
right,
who stabbed her 2 daughters to death.
Oh, that's horrific.
It is, yeah.
So was she diagnosed as a psychopath?
No, she wasn't.
She wasn't. Yeah.
The forensic psychiatrist who evaluated her determined that she didn't fit into any of the existing psychiatric categories.
Wow.
For mental illness.
Okay.
She wasn't depressed, psychotic, or exhibiting signs of a personality disorder.
So she killed her own children.
Right.
But she wasn't considered mentally ill.
And that's precisely the point the book is trying to make.
Okay.
It argues that our current psychiatric classification system might be, inadequate. When it comes to empathy disorders. According to the DSM, the standard diagnostic manual for mental illness.
Right.
You're either mentally ill or mentally normal. There's no in between.
So this woman who committed this unimaginable act of violence was essentially labeled as normal because she didn't fit neatly into any existing category.
Exactly. And the book, it suggests that this highlights a major flaw.
What flaw?
Yeah, in how we diagnose and understand conditions related to empathy.
Okay.
It calls for a new category.
A new category.
Yeah, empathy disorder.
Empathy disorder.
To account for individuals who fall outside traditional classifications, but clearly exhibit a lack of empathy, at least at the time of their crimes.
It sounds like we're trying to fit square pegs into round holes.
Perfect analogy. Yeah. And it's it's crucial to understand that this isn't just some academic debate.
Right.
It has, real world implications.
Real world implications.
Yeah, for how we approach things like criminal responsibility and sentencing.
So if someone is diagnosed with an empathy disorder,
right,
does that mean they shouldn't be held accountable for their actions?
Well, that's where things get, really complex.
Right.
The book dives into these very questions. Yeah. The moral and legal implications of 0 degrees of empathy.
Right.
It acknowledges that in some cases imprisonment is necessary, to protect society and provide a sense of justice.
Right. But what about cases like Gary McKinnon, the hacker we discussed earlier?
Right.
He had Asperger's.
Yeah.
And he didn't seem to, pose any real threat.
Right.
Should someone like him be punished the same way as a violent criminal?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
The book, suggests that in certain cases, particularly those involving nonviolent offenses,
right,
compassion and understanding might be more appropriate than punishment.
Okay.
It proposes exploring alternative approaches like offering support and opportunity for individuals with empathy disorders to use their unique skills for the benefit of society.
So instead of sending Gary McKinnon to prison,
right,
maybe he could have been, recruited to help the Pentagon strengthen its security systems.
Precisely. It's about finding solutions that address the underlying causes of behavior rather than, simply resorting to punitive measures.
Right. But what about the idea that even individuals with, quote unquote, normal levels of empathy can commit horrific acts?
Yeah.
Like in the case of the Holocaust.
Right.
That seems to contradict the idea that low empathy is a prerequisite for cruelty, right?
Yeah, you're bringing up Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil again, which we touched on earlier.
Yeah,
it's a powerful idea,
right?
And it certainly challenges this notion that only individuals with 0 degrees of empathy are capable of evil.
Right. It suggests that ordinary people swept up in the wrong circumstances can become complicit in terrible things.
Exactly. It's crucial to remember that 0 degrees of empathy isn't the only explanation for human cruelty,
right?
Social pressures, obedience to authority,
right?
And a host of other factors can contribute to terrible outcomes.
Oh, it's not a simple equation. It's this complex web of individual and societal forces that can lead us down these dark paths.
Precisely.
Yeah, and understanding these complexities is essential if we want to prevent future atrocities. We've explored the banality of evil and the individualistic nature of 0 degrees of empathy.
Right.
But where does that leave us when we try to understand something like terrorism?
Yeah.
Surely not all terrorists fit the mold of a psychopath.
Right. And this is where things get especially
complicated.
Yeah, complicated, both morally and ethically.
Yeah.
The book dives into this intricate relationship between terrorism and empathy, acknowledging that terrorists often act out of, a strong ideological conviction or in response to what they perceive as profound injustices.
So it's like this distorted form of empathy. They're fighting for a cause, even if it means, harming others.
It's certainly a complex and often, troubling manifestation of empathy.
Right.
The book, it grapples with this question, can we judge the same act of murder differently based on its motivations?
I honestly don't know if I have an answer for that.
Yeah.
It's a thorny issue, to say the least.
It is. The book it uses the example of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi.
Okay.
A terrorist leader in Iraq who was notorious for his brutality.
Right.
But then it, points to figures like Nelson Mandela and Menachem Begin, who both, engaged in violence during their political struggles, but later became, Nobel Peace Prize laureates.
That's a pretty striking contrast.
It is.
1 minute they're terrorists, the next minute they're peacemakers.
Exactly. It highlights the difficulty of judging actions within their historical and political contexts.
Right.
But the book, it emphasizes that at the moment of violence, empathy seems to be absent, regardless of the larger motivations or justifications.
So whether it's a terrorist attack or a crime of passion, that moment of violence is marked by this fundamental lack of empathy for the victim.
Exactly, and that's a sobering thought, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah, it forces us to confront the potential for darkness within ourselves, even if we believe we're acting for some greater good.
It really does.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? If empathy is so crucial, for our individual and collective well-being, how do we cultivate it more consciously?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The book explores several potential avenues, including, education, therapies that target the empathy circuit, and interventions like oxytocin nasal spray.
You mentioned educational software earlier.
Yeah.
How does that work? Are we talking about like teaching empathy through video games or something?
It's not quite video games, but the concept is is similar.
Okay.
The book highlights this program called mind reading.
Mind reading.
That uses videos and interactive exercises
Okay.
to help people better understand and recognize emotions in others.
So it's like a workout regimen for your empathy muscles.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And studies have shown that it can effectively improve emotion recognition skills.
Okay.
Which is, a key component of empathy.
Okay. What about therapies that target the empathy circuit? How do those work?
One promising approach involves role-playing exercises.
Okay.
Imagine putting yourself in the shoes of someone who has been hurt,
right,
or wronged by your actions.
Right.
And by experiencing their perspective, you can begin to develop a deeper understanding of the impact of your behavior.
Like virtual reality for empathy.
You could say that, it allows you to step outside your own, limited viewpoint,
right,
and connect with the emotional reality of another person.
That sounds
intense,
yeah,
but incredibly, valuable.
Yeah.
It can be, and it's not a quick fix, of course.
Right.
Cultivating empathy takes time and effort.
But are there any shortcuts? You mentioned oxytocin nasal spray earlier.
Yeah.
Is that something that could give us an instant empathy boost?
It's not quite that simple.
Okay.
While early research suggests that oxytocin can enhance empathy in certain situations, it's not a magic bullet.
Okay, so no empathy in a bottle.
Right.
But it is interesting to think that we might have these pharmacological tools to help, help boost empathy.
Yeah, it's sort of like an emotional supplement. Yeah. It's certainly an area of active research, right, and the ethical implications of such interventions are something we'll need to carefully consider as the science advances.
For sure. But even without those interventions,
right,
the book seems to suggest that empathy is something that we can all learn and cultivate.
Absolutely. It might not be, easy, especially for those who struggle with low empathy, but it's possible.
Possible.
Yeah. And the book, it offers some guidance on how we can, start to nudge ourselves in a more empathic direction.
Okay. So what are some practical steps we can take? I'm ready to boost my empathy levels.
Well, one simple but powerful practice is to pay attention to people's, facial expressions and body language.
Right.
We often miss these subtle cues that can tell us a lot about how someone is feeling.
It's like becoming an emotional detective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the more attuned we become to those, those nonverbal signals, the better we can understand what others are experiencing.
I like that, emotional detective.
Yeah.
What else can we do?
Another key strategy is active listening.
Active listening.
Yeah, it's not just about, hearing the words someone is saying,
right,
but truly trying to understand their perspective and feelings.
So put away the distractions, make eye contact, and really focus on what the other person is trying to communicate.
Exactly, and ask clarifying questions.
Oh.
Show that you're engaged and genuinely interested in what they have to say.
So it's about making that person feel heard and understood.
Precisely,
Yeah.
and that feeling of being understood,
right,
it can be incredibly powerful. It can, build trust, reduce conflict, and strengthen relationships.
So active listening, paying attention to nonverbal cues,
Yeah.
and stepping outside our own perspectives to understand the experiences of others.
Right.
These are all things that we can practice in our daily lives.
Yeah.
To cultivate greater empathy.
They are, and remember, empathy is a skill, right?
That can be, honed with practice. The more we use it, the stronger it becomes.
No, it's like a muscle that we need to exercise regularly.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And just like any muscle, it can atrophy if we neglect it.
Right.
So make a conscious effort to flex your empathy muscles every day.
I'm definitely going to be more mindful of that.
Good.
So we've talked about practical steps we can take to boost our empathy levels.
Right.
But what about those who fall at the extreme end of of the spectrum.
Okay.
You know, the super empathizers.
Yeah, the book explores this fascinating question.
Oh, wait.
But it's a bit more speculative.
Okay.
It suggests that super empathizers might experience a heightened sensitivity.
A heightened sensitivity.
Yeah, to the emotions of others.
Okay.
Almost to the point of being, overwhelmed.
So it's like their empathy is always turned up to 11. Something like that. Yeah, they might feel deeply moved by even the slightest hint of, sadness or joy in others.
That sounds both, amazing and exhausting.
It could be. And in the book, it raises the question of whether, super empathy might actually be maladaptive in some way.
Maladaptive? How so?
Well, if you're constantly absorbing the emotions of everyone around you,
right,
it might be difficult to separate your own feelings from theirs.
You'd be like an emotional sponge.
Yeah.
Soaking up all the good and bad vibes
Exactly.
around.
Yeah, exactly. And that could that could lead to emotional burnout or even a loss of your own sense of self.
Right. It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Right.
You need to take care of your own emotional well-being before you can truly empathize with others.
That's a great point. And it highlights the importance of finding a healthy balance when it comes to empathy.
Balance.
Yeah, you don't want to shut it down completely.
Right.
But you also don't want to be so overwhelmed by it that you lose yourself in the process.
It's all about finding that sweet spot.
Exactly.
So the book paints this really complex picture of empathy.
It does.
This spectrum that ranges from 0 degrees to super empathy with all sorts of variations in between.
Yeah.
And it argues that understanding this spectrum is really crucial for addressing some of the most pressing issues facing humanity, from violence and crime to conflict and inequality.
It does, and it challenges us to reconsider our own relationship with empathy. How we cultivate it in ourselves, how we foster it in our communities, and how we use it as a force for good in the world.
That's a powerful message.
It is,
and one that I think we all need to hear.
I agree.
It really is a powerful message. So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
If empathy is such a potent force, both for good and for evil, how do we ensure it's channeled toward positive change?
Right. That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
And while the book doesn't offer, any simple solutions, it does highlight some inspiring examples. Like take the Parent Circle.
Yeah, Parent Circle.
The organization we talked about earlier that, brings together bereaved families from both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by creating a space for dialogue and shared grief. They're fostering empathy in a place where it seems almost impossible.
It's incredible to think that something as powerful as empathy can emerge from such profound loss and pain.
Yeah.
It's like they're planting seeds of hope in the most unlikely of places.
Exactly. And those seeds can blossom into something truly transformative.
Right.
The book also emphasizes the importance of, actively promoting empathy in education, weaving it into the fabric of our schools and communities.
So not just hoping it develops naturally, but actually teaching it.
Yeah.
Nurturing empathy as a core life skill.
Precisely. Imagine a world where empathy is valued as highly as intelligence or athletic ability.
Right.
A world where it's, woven into the curriculum, where children learn to understand and appreciate diverse perspectives from a young age.
That's a beautiful vision.
It is.
But how do we get there?
Yeah.
It seems like such a monumental task.
It starts with each of us, by recognizing the power of empathy and making a conscious effort to cultivate it in our own lives.
Okay.
We become part of the solution.
So by paying attention to the emotions of others, practicing active listening, and challenging our own biases and assumptions.
Exactly. It also means being willing to step outside our comfort zones and connect with people who are different from us, to see the world through their eyes, and understand their experiences.
It's about recognizing our our shared humanity. You know, that common ground that connects us all despite our differences.
And remembering that empathy is not a, not a weakness, but a strength.
The strength.
It's what enables us to build genuine connections,
right?
To resolve conflicts peacefully, and to create a more compassionate and just world.
I love that reframing.
Yeah.
Empathy is a strength.
Yeah.
It's such a powerful shift in perspective.
It is, and it's a message that I believe we all need to embrace.
Well, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive. We've explored the darkness of human behavior, but we've also witnessed the extraordinary power of empathy to heal and connect us.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
And I hope our listener has gained some new insights and perspectives.
Oh, I know I have.
Good.
And I think it's left me with a renewed sense of hope.
Yeah.
If we can all tap into the power of empathy, imagine the possibilities for creating a world that is, more compassionate and more humane.
I couldn't agree more.
So to our listener, we leave you with this final thought to ponder.
Okay.
If empathy is indeed the key to unlocking our shared humanity and building a better future,
right?
How can you cultivate it more consciously in your own life?
Yeah. In
your relationships and in your community.
It's a question worth reflecting on.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the science of evil and the power of empathy.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those sparks of connection that make us human.